So props are important, as you can tell, and thus far we're specifying props like this, as an array of the props we expect to get, where every prop is just added as a string. I mentioned that this would be the bare minimum configuration. With that, you let Vue know about the props you expect to get, but you don't provide any other information to Vue. This is okay, especially for simple apps or simple components, but for more complex components, and especially when working in a team, for example, you might want to share more information about your props. Simply so that Vue can let you know if you pass incorrect data to a component or if you forgot some required prop. And for that, you can replace this array of props. Actually, I'll copy it and comment it out so that we still have it for reference. You can replace it with an object. And in that object, you now have your props as JavaScript property names and then certain values for them. And here, the most basic extra information you could provide is the type of data you expect to get. For example, string. To make it clear that the value of the name prop should be a string. And if instead a number would be provided, we would get an error. Side note, I'm speaking of a number type being provided, not text that contains a number. That would of course be okay since it would be a string. So we can do that instead, and now make it clear that all our data at the moment at least is getting a string, like this. So now we're saying that this component will get a name, a phone number, an email address, and a isFavorite prop, and every prop should get a value of type string. And hence, this of course works, but now we provide more information. But you can be even more detailed than that. Instead of just providing that type here, you can provide an object as a value for the prop you're expecting to get. And in this object, you now can add a type property, which holds the type of that prop you want to get, but you can also add more properties. Now, not any properties of your choice, instead specific properties Vue will look for. For example, type, but also required, to indicate whether this prop, the name prop here, should be required or not. And this should be true or false. So here we could make it clear that this component, the friend contact component, needs a name prop. This is required. And we can do the same, of course, for the other props. Type string and the phone number is also required. And also for the email address. We want to get a string and it is required. Now, let's say the isFavorite prop is also of type string, but it's not required. In that case, if you have a non-required prop, you can add a default key, where you provide a default value which will be used if the prop should be missing. So here, for example, 0, so that by default, this component is not a favorite. Default can also be a function, by the way, where you could have a more complex code snippet that executes to derive the default. But here, I'll just set this to 0 as a string. You can also add a validator, which holds a function which should return true or false. This validator function will get the value provided for the prop, and then you can have any validation logic of your choice to find out whether that's a valid value or not. So here for isFavorite, for example, we could check if value is equal to 1, or if value is equal to 0, and that will therefore yield true if either of the two is correct, or false if we get a totally different value. So with that, we could make sure that really only the values 1 and 0 are allowed here. And what's the whole idea behind that? Well, with that more detailed configuration here, we can go to the place where we use our component and, for example, omit isFavorite, let's say on the second component here, on Jolie. With that, the app still works because we made this prop isFavorite non-required. It's optional. We have a default fallback value. On the other hand, if I remove the name here and save that, we don't get an error here. But if we open up the developer tools and the JavaScript console there, we get a warning by Vue that we got a missing required prop name. And that helps us as a developer to spot such mistake quicker during development. And we don't have to guess why the component now is not working anymore. Instead, we get a clear warning. So that's very useful. Hence, let's bring back that name. If I provide an invalid value for is favorite, for example, we got the invalid prop warning because our custom validator check failed. We didn't provide 1 or 0, but instead 100, which is simply not valid as specified here. So you can have more complex prop definitions to make sure that your component really gets used correctly. Now, ultimately, of course, it's your component, so it's up to you how detailed you want to be. If you have an entire project on which you work on your own, you might not need those more detailed configurations because you know all your components and all your props anyways. But if you're sharing your component with other people as a third-party package or because you're working in a team, you might want to provide such more detailed prop definitions so that everyone who's using your component is quickly able to see how that component works, which data it needs, and when a prop is valid or not valid. Getting such extra warnings here can then really be helpful and make your life as a developer much, much easier. And that's the idea behind more complex prop definitions and prop validations, which I showed you here. Now, for the majority of the course, I will use the simpler types of definitions, either this array or just defining the value type. But I want you to be aware of that so that if you are working in a bigger project, you do know how to be more explicit regarding your props and how they should look like.